He'd bullied the entire town of Crestwood Falls for 3 years, and nobody had dared to touch him. Former cop, huge, brutal. If he slapped someone, that person lowered their head. If he barked at someone, that person went silent. Not once, not a single person in this little town had dared to meet Tucker Baines's eyes without looking away. But on that Sunday morning, he chose the wrong person. The elderly white woman he slapped to the diner floor, the woman lying there with a cheek swelling red, trembling but not crying, was the mother of the most powerful mafia boss in the region. The skinny waitress, hands shaking, a faint old scar still visible on her lip from the last time her husband beat her, the one who stepped out into the middle of the room, planted herself between him and that woman, and said enough, while the whole place stayed frozen, was the very ex-wife who'd escaped him 3 years earlier. And when the door of the Redstone Grill opened again, the man who walked in wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero out of a movie. He was a monster 100 times more terrifying than Tucker Baines. Only this monster looked at the old woman on the floor and called her by a single word: Mom. Tucker Baines had made the last mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. This is the story of Kendrick Vaughn, of Brielle Ashford, and of the morning when the fear that had ruled Crestwood Falls for 3 years finally met the one person who didn't know fear. Have you ever witnessed a thin woman, hands shaking, blood on her mouth, standing in front of an old lady on a diner floor while the whole room didn't move? Have you ever wondered what you would do if you were in that room? Leave us a comment and tell us what city and what country you're watching from. And if you believe courage isn't the absence of fear, but standing up while you're afraid, hit like and subscribe right now. But to understand why an entire town stayed silent when an elderly woman was slapped to the floor, you need to know who Tucker Baines was, and what he'd done to Crestwood Falls over the past 3 years. Tucker Baines used to be a deputy with the Crestwood Falls Police Department. Not the kind of cop people talk about in movies. He was the kind who, when he rolled through on patrol, didn't make folks feel safer. He made them feel more afraid. He was fired after an excessive force incident involving a black suspect, a 19-year-old kid who'd been pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up with a broken nose and 3 teeth left behind on the sidewalk. Nobody prosecuted Tucker. The guys at the department covered for him. Reports got rewritten. Witnesses got threatened. And that kid moved out of town the very next week and never came back. Tucker lost his badge, but he didn't lose his power. He stayed in Crestwood Falls, living in a 1-story house on Birch Lane, driving an old blue Ford, and little by little he turned the whole town into his own backyard. If he walked into a place, that place served him for free. Not because he asked with words. All he had to do was sit down, fix the owner with those cloudy eyes, and nobody dared set a bill on his table. Ray Gentry, the owner of the Redstone Grill, had been pouring Tucker free beer and feeding him free meals for 2 years. Once, just once, Ray tried to lay a bill down. Tucker didn't say a thing. He only picked up the paper, tore it clean in half, let it fall to the floor, and stared at Ray until he bent down and picked it up. After that day, Ray never tried again. Tucker parked across the road, blocking the way, and not a single person dared honk. One time, Mr. Morrison, 72 years old, black, was walking past the grocery store, moving a little slow because his knees hurt. Tucker came up behind him, impatient, put a hand on the old man's back, and shoved. Mr. Morrison went down on the sidewalk, knees scraped, hands bleeding. 5 people saw it. Nobody said a word. Nobody called the police. Because who were you supposed to call the police on? His own former co-workers? The same men who'd shielded him when he broke a 19-year-old boy's nose? That was the trap Crestwood Falls had been caught in for 3 years. Tucker didn't need a gun. He didn't need a badge. He didn't need the law. He only needed fear. And fear is free. It breeds on its own. It spreads on its own. It locks every front door from the inside. He was big, his face always flushed, his hands broad as shovels, and wherever he went he took up as much space as he could. Legs stretched out, arms wide, voice loud, laughter louder, like the whole world was his living room, and everyone else was just an uninvited guest. Women avoided walking past him. Men lowered their eyes when he looked at them. Kids were warned not to play near the street where he lived. And so, 3 years went by. Fear didn't visit Crestwood Falls. It lived here. It had a name. It had an address. It drove an old blue Ford and sat at the middle table of the Redstone Grill every morning, until that Sunday morning, when it picked the wrong person to put its hands on. But Tucker Baines wasn't the only person in Crestwood Falls living under a name that didn't belong to him. There was another woman, a woman almost no one in town knew much about beyond the fact that she waitressed at the Redstone Grill, poured coffee fast, spoke little, and never held anyone's gaze for too long. Her name was Brielle Ashford. At least, that was the name she used now. Brielle was 27, but if you looked at her, you'd think she was older. Not because of wrinkles, but because of her eyes. The eyes of someone who'd seen too much, too early, too much of what a 27-year-old should never have to see. She woke every morning at 4:30 in a shabby studio on the 3rd floor of an old building on Elm Street. There wasn't any hot water. A crack ran down the mirror from top to bottom, splitting her face into 2 halves whenever she looked at herself. The walls were yellowed, the ceiling low, the window facing an alleyway the sun never reached. Every morning, before her feet ever touched the floor, Brielle had a habit she never told anyone about. She sat still for about 10 seconds and listened for footsteps outside the door, for someone else's breathing in the room, for the smell of cigarettes or beer. Only when she was sure she was alone did she stand up. It was the habit of someone who'd once woken up with a man's hand around her throat. Brielle had no father, no mother. She'd been placed into the foster system when she was too young to remember the faces of the people who'd brought her into the world. 3 foster homes in 12 years. The first family sent her back after 5 months because she wasn't a good fit. The second kept her for 3 years, fed her, clothed her, but never let her sit at the dinner table with their biological children. The third was where she learned that pain didn't always come from strangers. Her foster father beat her with a leather belt whenever she made a mistake, and sometimes even when she hadn't made one at all. She went to school with bruises lined along her arms, and not a single teacher asked. Not one person asked. At 19, Brielle aged out with a small bag of clothes and nothing else. No diploma, no money, no family, no address to go back to. She did every kind of work she could, washing dishes, mopping floors, cleaning rooms in cheap motels, trying to survive one day at a time. Then she met him, Wade Pruitt, nearly 20 years older than her, tall, broad, and for the first time in her life, someone told Brielle she was beautiful. Someone opened car doors for her, bought her a new pair of shoes, said, "I'll take care of you." Brielle didn't know what love looked like because she'd never seen it. So when Wade took her hand and said, "Marry me," she thought that was love. She said yes after 4 months. A small wedding. No guests. No family. Just the 2 of them in front of a justice of the peace. The first month, Wade was gentle. The second month, Wade started controlling. She wasn't allowed to go out without him. Wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. Wasn't allowed to look at anyone for too long. Her phone was taken. Her car keys were hidden. The house was locked from the outside when he left for work. The 3rd month, the first punch came. To her stomach, where no one would see. After that, it was her face, her back, her neck. Wade hit Brielle like she was something that belonged to him, and he had the right to do whatever he wanted with what belonged to him. The worst time, Wade choked her on the kitchen floor until her eyes rolled back, until her hands stopped clawing, until her legs stopped kicking. Then he let go. He watched her lying there, gasping like a fish on dry land, and said in a normal voice, like he was talking about the weather, "Next time I won't stop." One rainy night, when Wade was dead asleep from drinking, Brielle took a small bag, $47 from his jacket pocket, and slipped out the back door. She walked 4 miles through the rain to the nearest bus station, carrying nothing but that bag of clothes and the faint scar on her wrist, where she'd once hurt herself on nights she couldn't take it anymore. She changed her last name, changed states, changed everything that could be changed, and she came to Crestwood Falls, a town small enough to disappear in, poor enough that no one asked questions, and sad enough that a young woman with old eyes wouldn't stand out. Ray Gentry hired her at the Redstone Grill without asking much. Maybe he saw something in her eyes and chose not to ask. She worked hard, arrived first, left last, never complained, never talked about herself. She lived on tips and invisibility, and for the first time in 27 years, Brielle Ashford felt something she'd never had. Safety. She didn't know that safety was an illusion. She didn't know the man she'd run from had changed his name too, changed states too, and come here. And he was living 3 streets away from her, sitting at the middle table of the diner where she worked every day, drinking free beer, and never once looking closely enough at the waitress to recognize her. Never once. Not until that Sunday morning. 3 months before that fateful Sunday morning, on a cold, rainy Saturday, an elderly white woman walked into the Redstone Grill for the first time. She wore a gray wool coat worn thin at the elbows, her silver hair neatly brushed back, her back slightly bowed but her stride still carrying the straightness of someone who refused to let old age bend her spirit. Her name was Dorothy Vaughn, 67 years old, living alone in a small house at the end of Oak Street, less than a 10-minute walk from the diner. Brielle was the one who waited on her that day. She brought the menu over, quick and polite, eyes never lingering, voice just loud enough to hear and not a word more than necessary. Dorothy ordered hot tea and toast, took the table by the window, and watched the young woman turn away with her tray. She didn't say anything else that first time. But she noticed something no one else in the diner noticed, or no one cared to notice. This girl wasn't cold. She was afraid. Afraid of conversation. Afraid of being looked at. Afraid of existing too clearly in any space at all. Dorothy knew those eyes. She'd seen them in the mirror many years ago, back when she was young, and life hadn't yet given her enough strength to lift her chin. So she didn't ask questions. She didn't judge. She simply came back the next Saturday. Then the Saturday after that. Then the Saturday after that. Always the same table by the window. Always hot tea and toast. Always, "Thank you, honey," when Brielle set the cup down, and always a tip that was twice the bill. Brielle noticed that steadiness. In a life where nothing was steady, nothing was certain, Dorothy's presence every Saturday became the closest thing to stability she'd ever known. She started brewing the tea ahead of time before Dorothy arrived. She set the cup on the window table before 8 o'clock because Dorothy always came at exactly 8. One morning, colder than usual, Brielle stood outside the diner waiting for Ray to bring the keys, shivering in the only thin jacket she owned. Dorothy came early that day. She looked at the girl standing there, hunched against the cold, and didn't say much. She only took the old wool scarf from around her own neck and draped it over Brielle's shoulders. "It's cold, and you don't have a warm coat," she said softly. That was all. No lecture, no pity, no questions about why a 27-year-old woman didn't have a proper coat to her name. Brielle stood there with the scarf, still holding the warmth of another body, and she didn't know what to say. She only nodded, swallowed the tight knot in her throat, and opened the diner door. That night, in her dark, cold studio, Brielle slept with that scarf in her arms. For the first time, she held something that wasn't the knife she kept under her pillow. From there, their relationship grew, slowly, without noise, without promises, built only from small things repeated again and again. Dorothy started asking whether Brielle had eaten yet. Brielle started sitting down beside her for 2 minutes on her break instead of standing alone in the kitchen to eat. Once, Brielle came down with a bad cold, but still showed up to work, because if she didn't work, she didn't get paid. And without pay, she couldn't make rent. Dorothy saw Brielle's red eyes, her swollen nose, the way her hands shook when she carried her tray. Then she reached out and took Brielle's wrist, gentle but firm, and said, "You need rest. Money can wait. Your health can't." No one had ever said words like that to Brielle, not once. Not her birth parents, not her foster families, not Wade Pruitt. Not a single person in all 27 years of her life had ever held her hand and told her she should rest. Brielle went into the diner bathroom that day and cried. Not because she was sad, because for the first time she understood what it felt like to be cared for by someone who didn't want to take anything from her. Dorothy would sometimes talk about her son. Not much, just a few gentle sentences between sips of tea. "He's in business, always busy, doesn't come home much, but he's a good boy. Every month he sends money, calls to check on me. He tells me not to do anything heavy, but do I listen?" She'd smile when she said it. The smile of a mother who was both proud and missing her child. She never said her son's name, never said what he did, never said where he was. She only said he, and her eyes would brighten every time she mentioned him. And Brielle didn't ask. More than anyone, she understood that sometimes people didn't tell their stories not because they didn't trust you, but because telling meant explaining, and explaining meant pain. She only knew Dorothy had a son somewhere out there, someone who loved his mother, sent money, and didn't come home. And Dorothy had her, sitting across from her every Saturday, in a little diner where fear sat right at the middle table. 2 women, one old and one young, both white, finding each other not because fate arranged it, but because both of them knew what loneliness looked like, and both of them were tired of it. while Dorothy sat sipping tea at the Redstone Grill every Saturday and spoke about her son in short, proud sentences. In a city more than 400 miles from Crestwood Falls, that son was sitting at the head of a long table in a windowless room, and 6 men were waiting for him to speak. Kendrick Vaughn was 36, tall, broad-shouldered, white, his face like it had been carved from stone. He wore a dark shirt, no tie, no jewelry, nothing extra on him. He didn't need any of that to make people understand who he was. The way he sat, back straight, hands set on the table, eyes on each man one by one without blinking, said enough. The Vaughn Syndicate wasn't the kind of organization that showed up in the news. It had no name in public records, no headquarters, no business cards, nothing the police could grab without it slipping right through their fingers. But half the city knew the name Vaughn, knew that if Kendrick Vaughn wanted a door to open, it would open. And if he wanted it closed, nobody on this earth had a key that could open it again. The meeting that night was tense. A deal had collapsed. Someone had betrayed them. Montel Price, Kendrick's right hand, 34, shoulders like a steel cabinet, stood against the wall behind him, reading every face at the table the way a man reads a battlefield map. One man at the far end of the table was sweating, twisting his ring, eyes too scared to lift. Kendrick saw everything. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He only asked one question, his voice low and steady. "Where's the money?" The room went cold. The man at the end swallowed hard and started to explain. Kendrick raised one finger. The man shut his mouth. Kendrick didn't need the reasons. He only needed to know who and how much. The rest, Montel would handle. The meeting ended in 15 minutes. Nobody stayed any longer than necessary in the same room as Kendrick Vaughn. When everyone was gone, Kendrick stayed behind alone, and in that pocket of silence, he wasn't Vaughn anymore. He was only Dorothy's son. He remembered the small kitchen in their old house, the smell of black beans and rice cooking on a cheap electric stove, his mother standing there with her back turned, thin shoulders, hands that never stopped working. Dorothy did 2 jobs for Kendrick's entire childhood. By day, she cleaned other people's houses. By night, she washed dishes at an Italian restaurant downtown. She ate leftovers so her son could eat fresh food, wore old clothes so he could have something decent for school, never complained, never cried in front of him, never said, "I'm tired," even though there were always dark circles under her eyes. Kendrick grew up with a vow he never spoke out loud, but carried in his bones. His mother would never suffer again. Not ever. The road he chose to keep that vow wasn't clean. He knew it. But the vow was absolute. Every month he sent money home to Dorothy, enough that she didn't have to work, enough that she could live comfortably in her little house in Crestwood Falls. He called every week, asked what she'd eaten, whether she'd slept well, whether her knees were hurting. She always said, "I'm fine, don't you worry." And he always knew she was lying, because she was Dorothy, and Dorothy would rather hurt than let her son carry the worry. That night, after the meeting, Kendrick sat in his car and looked out at the city through the glass. Lights flickered below, millions of people living, breathing, fearing, loving, and in a small town more than 400 miles away, his mother was sleeping alone. He pulled out his phone and called an old friend in Crestwood Falls. "I need a favor. Sunday morning, you set it up and invite my mom to breakfast at the Redstone Grill. Tell her someone wants to treat her. Don't say it's me," the old friend asked. A surprise. Kendrick didn't answer that. He only said, "Can you do it?" "Yeah. Good." He hung up. Then he turned to Montel in the driver's seat. "Get the car ready. Tomorrow we're going back to Crestwood Falls." Montel looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Now, in the middle of this, the deal just fell apart. Someone betrayed us, and you're leaving." Kendrick looked back. One look. Montel didn't ask another question. The next morning, the black car left the city before the sun came up. Kendrick sat in the back seat, eyes closed, but he didn't sleep. He was thinking about his mother, about her smile when she saw him walk in, about the hug he'd been missing for months. He'd planned it perfectly. Just breakfast, just a hug, just watching his mother smile. He didn't know that Sunday morning he would walk into the Redstone Grill and see something that wasn't in any plan. He would see his mother on the floor, and he would see a skinny waitress, blood on her lip, standing between his mother and a man twice her size, refusing to step back. That Sunday morning, Brielle came to the Redstone Grill at 6 o'clock, earlier than the sun. She unlocked the back door, switched on the lights, tied on her apron, pulled her hair neatly back at the nape of her neck, and started wiping tables from the last one to the first, the way she did every day. The smell of brewed coffee drifted out from behind the counter, mixing with old wood and the grease that lived in the kitchen. Ray Gentry arrived 15 minutes after she did, giving a quiet little whistle as he passed the kitchen door, checking the gas burners, turning on the exhaust fan. An ordinary morning. At least, it looked like one. Customers started coming in at 7. A few older couples took their usual tables, ordered their usual food, and talked softly about the weather and the price of gas. A man in the corner read his newspaper. Black coffee, no sugar. 2 women sat near the north window and shared a plate of pancakes. Nothing was different. Nothing warned them. At 7:15, Dorothy walked in. Brielle looked up from behind the counter and knew right away she was dressed differently than usual. Not the gray wool coat worn thin at the elbows that Brielle had gotten used to. Today she wore a dark brown coat, clean and pressed, and underneath it a white blouse with a small collar. Small pearl earrings, silver hair brushed with extra care. She stepped inside with a smile Brielle had never seen on her. The smile of someone waiting for something special without knowing what it was. Brielle led her to the window table and set down the cup of tea she'd already brewed. Dorothy smiled and said, "Someone's treating me to breakfast today. I don't know who. I just know someone told my friend to tell me to come here." Her eyes sparkled. She turned the teacup on its saucer, excited like a young girl headed out on a first date. Brielle smiled and dipped her head slightly. "You look so pretty today." Dorothy gave her hand a light pat. "Oh, stop, honey." Brielle went back to the counter, her chest feeling a little lighter just from seeing Dorothy happy. She didn't know who was treating her to breakfast. She didn't need to know. She only needed to see Dorothy smile. 7:20. The front door opened again, and everything changed. Tucker Baines walked in. The bright Sunday morning was blocked by his shadow filling the doorway. The smell of beer clung to him even this early. Cloudy eyes, flushed face, wide shoulders, heavy steps. He didn't look at anyone, and he didn't have to, because he knew everyone was looking at him. The conversation in the diner dropped by half in 2 seconds. The 2 women sharing pancakes stopped talking. The man with the newspaper dipped his head lower. The older couples looked down at their plates. Ray Gentry behind the counter quietly poured a beer and carried it out before Tucker even sat down. Tucker took the middle table, stretched his legs into the aisle, threw his arms across the backs of the chairs, and leaned back like he'd just bought the whole place, along with everyone inside it. Brielle stood behind the counter, fingers tight around her tray, and her instincts pulled her backward toward the kitchen. She always avoided Tucker's section, always took the long way around, always kept her head down. Not because she knew who he was, because her body recognized that kind of man before her mind could catch up, the kind who took up space, pressed down on everyone else, and treated other people's silence like permission. She'd lived with a man like that. Her body didn't forget. Outside, at the end of Maple Hollow Road, a black car sat quietly under the shadow of an oak tree. Montel turned off the engine. Kendrick sat in the back seat, looking through the window toward the Redstone Grill at the end of the street. He drew a long breath, adjusted the collar of his coat, and said, "Give me 5 minutes." No one in the diner knew that car was there. No one knew who was sitting inside it. Everything was in place. The old woman sat by the window waiting for someone she didn't know. The waitress held her tray, hiding behind the counter. The bully sat in the middle of the diner, legs blocking the aisle, believing he was king. And the son sat in a black car at the end of the road, ready to walk into a breakfast he thought would be the best moment of his year. Everything was ready. The only problem was, no one was ready for what was about to happen. Dorothy had been sitting by the window for about 10 minutes when she realized her tea was out of sugar. She'd taken 2 sips, and it tasted thinner than usual. Maybe Brielle had been rushed this morning and forgot. She didn't want to bother the young woman who was busy serving several tables at once, so she stood up herself, planning to walk over to the small condiment station in the corner of the diner, where the sugar jar, the salt jar, and a few little creamers sat on a low wooden shelf. The condiment station was on the other side of the room, and the shortest path to it meant passing the middle table, Tucker Baines's table. Dorothy didn't know who Tucker was. She came in on Saturdays, and Tucker usually came on weekdays. The 2 of them had almost never been in the same space. To her, he was just a big white man sitting in the middle of the morning with a beer. She walked slowly but with her back straight, carefully stepping through the narrow aisle between the tables. but the aisle had been taken over by Tucker's legs. Both of his legs were stretched out, his dirty shoes crossed at the ankles, blocking the walkway like a barrier he'd set up not for comfort, but for power. Everyone else had to go around, always. Dorothy didn't know that rule. She stepped forward, trying not to touch him, but the space was too tight, and when she angled her body to slip by, the sleeve of her dark brown coat brushed his shoulder. That was all, a touch lighter than wind. She didn't even realize it had happened. She kept walking, almost to the condiment station. Then, behind her, the scrape of a chair across tile sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sharp, harsh. It killed every conversation in the diner on the spot. "Hey!" Tucker's voice ripped through the air. Dorothy stopped and turned slowly, confused. Tucker was already on his feet, his chair shoved back so hard it bumped the table behind him, his beer glass trembling on the tabletop. His face was redder than usual, veins rising in his neck, eyes wide. "You just touched me," he roared. Not a question. An accusation. Dorothy stood there with one hand still lifted toward the condiment shelf, like she was caught halfway through a simple errand, her eyes wide, not yet understanding what was happening. "I'm sorry," she started, her voice soft and polite, the reflex of someone who'd lived her whole life surviving on gentleness. "I didn't know. I was just trying to—" Tucker didn't let her finish. He moved in 2 long steps, and the space between them vanished in less than a second. And he slapped her. His hand, broad as a shovel, swung across Dorothy's face with the full force of a man, 6'1", 187 pounds, striking a 67-year-old woman, who weighed less than 121. The sound of it didn't resemble a movie slap. It was heavier, duller, like flesh hitting flesh, bone colliding with bone. It echoed through the redstone grill and made everyone inside stop breathing at the same time. Dorothy stumbled sideways. Her shoulder hit the edge of the nearest table, and then her body went down onto the tile floor. Someone's teacup rattled. The 2 women's pancake plate slid crooked. The whole diner inhaled together and nobody exhaled. Dorothy lay on the floor with one hand braced against the tile, and the other pressed to her left cheek. Her cheek was already swelling red, a clear handprint rising on the skin. Her eyes were wide, not just from pain, but from shock. She didn't understand. What had she done? She'd only gone to get sugar. She'd only walked past. Her coat sleeve had brushed a stranger's shoulder, and now she was on the floor of a diner with her cheek burning and the thin taste of blood in her mouth because she'd bitten her tongue when the slap landed. Tucker stood over her, chest lifted, shoulders spread, breathing hard, not because he was tired, but because he was performing. He looked down at the old woman at his feet, and then looked around the diner, sweeping his gaze over every face, daring, hunting for someone brave enough to look back. No one did. Eyes dropped, shoulders tightened, hands clenched under tables, but nobody stood. "Get on your knees and apologize," Tucker said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, like he was giving a speech. "You touch me. You get on your knees and apologize. You hear me." Dorothy didn't kneel. She lay there, her hand trembling on the floor, trying to sit up, but a 67-year-old body didn't always obey. Her cheek was swollen red, tears spilling out, but she didn't cry out loud. Even lying on the floor, humiliated in front of a dozen people, Dorothy Vaughan didn't sob. Her dignity stayed intact, even as everything else had been struck and broken. Ray Gentry stood behind the counter, fist twisted tight around a white dish towel until his knuckles turned pale. He looked at Dorothy on the floor, at Tucker standing over her, and then down at his own feet. Those feet didn't move. 2 years of serving Tucker free beer. 2 years of bending down to pick up bills that had been torn in half. 2 years of fear had taught his legs one lesson and one lesson only. Stay still and you live. And he stayed still. The whole diner stayed still. A dozen people, a dozen sets of hands, a dozen mouths, and not one of them opened. 3 years of fear had made Crestwood Falls like this, a town full of people and emptied of courage. Dorothy lay on the floor alone, in the middle of a diner full of people. Brielle stood behind the counter, less than 10 steps from Dorothy, and she saw everything. She saw the slap. She saw Dorothy's body go down. She saw the swelling red cheek and the trembling hands on the tile. She saw Tucker standing over her, chest puffed out, mouth shouting, and the whole diner silent as a graveyard. Her hands crushed the aluminum tray so hard her fingers turned white. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could hear it in her ears, in her throat, in her temples. Every cell in her body was screaming the same command. Don't. Stay still. Lower your head. Disappear. This was what she'd done her whole life. This was the only survival skill she had. Become invisible. Don't draw attention. Don't look a furious man in the eye. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't breathe too loud. Stay still and you live. She'd learned that lesson as a child in her foster father's house. She'd perfected it during 4 years with Wade Pruitt. Stay still and you live. Stay still and you live. Stay still and you live. But then her eyes dropped to Dorothy. And everything stopped. The old woman lay on the tile, one hand braced on the floor, one hand holding her cheek, trying to sit up and not strong enough. The dark brown coat she'd worn so carefully today had slipped to one side, and her small pearl earring had fallen off and lay on the floor just inches away. That position. Brielle saw that position and the world around her disappeared. She wasn't in the Redstone Grill anymore. She was in a dark kitchen 3 years ago, on a cold floor, one hand to her face, blood in her mouth, and Wade standing over her, voice calm. Next time I won't stop. The same position, the same helplessness, the same silence around her. Back then there had been no one but the two of them, but the silence had been identical. The silence of people who didn't come to save you. The flashback lasted less than 3 seconds, but it burned through everything inside Brielle. Because the person on the floor this time wasn't her. It was Dorothy. It was the woman who'd given her a scarf when it was cold. The woman who'd held her hand and said, "You need rest." The closest thing to a mother Brielle had ever known in 27 years. And she was lying on the floor with a swollen red cheek, and nobody was standing up. Brielle set the tray down on the counter. The soft clink of metal against wood wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the diner it sounded like a gunshot. Ray Gentry turned his head. His eyes went wide when he saw her step out from behind the counter. He wanted to say something, to stop her, but his mouth opened and no sound came. Brielle walked, one step at a time, slow, not because she wanted drama, but because her legs felt weighted with lead. Every step was a battle between the survival instinct telling her to turn back, and something deeper, hotter, sharper, telling her to keep going. Every eye in the diner locked onto her, horrified, disbelieving. The waitress, the smallest one, the thinnest one, the weakest one, was the only person moving in a room full of frozen people. She walked straight to the middle of the diner and put herself between Tucker and Dorothy. Small, thin, an apron stained with coffee and grease, brown hair tied back with a few strands loose, standing tall. Enough. Her voice was quiet, a little rough, but it didn't shake. Those 2 words fell into the silence of the Redstone Grill like 2 stones dropped into still water. Tucker looked down at her. He had to look down because she was almost 2 heads shorter. His eyes blinked, surprised for a split second, and then his mouth curled into a smile. Not a happy smile. The smile of someone who'd just found a new prey. "What did you just say?" he asked, low and slow, like a cat playing with a mouse. Brielle swallowed. Her throat was dry. Her heart was beating 100 times a minute, but her feet didn't move back. "I said enough." Tucker stepped closer. 1 step. Now the space between them was only an arm's length. She could smell beer on his breath, stale sweat in his clothes, and her stomach turned because the smell was familiar. Familiar enough that her body recognized it before her mind could explain it. "Who do you think you are?" Tucker said, louder now, for the whole diner to hear. "You want to take a slap for that old lady?" She didn't answer. She only stood there, and Tucker slapped her. His hand came across Brielle's face, not as hard as the one he'd given Dorothy, but hard enough to snap her head to the side, hard enough to drive her lip into her teeth, hard enough to draw blood at the corner of her mouth. Her body lurched to the right, but her hand caught the back of a chair. Her knees buckled but didn't hit the floor. She held. She stayed on her feet. Slowly, she straightened, little by little, back tall. Blood ran from the corner of her mouth down her chin and dripped onto her apron. She turned her face back toward Tucker and repeated, her voice exactly the same as before. Not louder, not softer, not shakier. "I said enough." The diner went dead silent for the 3rd time, but this time it wasn't because they were afraid of Tucker. It was because for the first time in 3 years, someone in Crestwood Falls had taken a slap from Tucker Baines and hadn't fallen, hadn't run, hadn't apologized. She stood there and said it again. Tucker stared at her. His eyes narrowed. He studied Brielle's face for the first time since she'd started working here, because until now he'd never looked at her. She'd only been a shadow with a tray, invisible, not worth seeing. But now she was standing in front of him with blood on her mouth and her eyes locked on his, and there was something in her face that made him pause, a flicker of familiarity, a line of her features, a corner of her chin, the way her eyes looked at him, not with fear but with something deeper, older, like a memory he hadn't developed yet. He hadn't recognized her, not yet, but his instincts could smell it. He raised his hand again. Tucker's hand was still hanging in the air, ready for a second slap across Brielle's face, when the front door of the redstone grill opened. The little wind chime on the frame trembled, a thin, delicate jingle nobody usually noticed. But in the suffocating silence of the diner now, it rang as clearly as a church bell. Sunday sunlight poured through the open doorway, and then stopped, cut off by a man's silhouette. Kendrick Vaughn stood on the threshold, and the world outside disappeared behind him. He didn't hurry. He made no wasted movement. Black leather shoes moved over the tile without a sound except for two steady, certain beats, like a heartbeat. A dark, long coat, shoulders filling the doorway, black eyes sweeping the room in 2 seconds. 2 seconds were all Kendrick needed. He'd lived in a world where if you couldn't read a room in 2 seconds, you didn't live to see the third. His gaze caught everything like a camera firing in rapid succession. Tables nudged out of place, faces gone pale, shoulders curled in, eyes lowered, fear thick in the air like smoke. Then he saw Tucker, the big man, face red, arm raised, standing in the middle of the diner like he owned it. In front of him, a girl, small, thin, coffee stains on her apron, blood at the corner of her mouth, standing straight, not backing up. Behind that girl, on the floor, an elderly white woman with a swollen red cheek, trying to sit up. A dark brown coat, silver hair, a pearl earring on the tile. Kendrick Vaughn's world stopped. Everything. The Vaughn syndicate, the deal that had collapsed, the traitor, half the city under his control, all of it vanished in 1,000th of a second. There was only one image left. His mother. On the floor. One hand pressed to her cheek, eyes wet. Mom. One word. Low. Flat. Not a shout. Not a roar. Just one word pulled from the deepest part of the chest of a man an entire city feared, who in this moment, in this instant, was only a son looking at his mother after she'd been hit. The word fell into the room and someone drew a sharp breath. Dorothy on the floor looked up, eyes widening, her hand stopping its tremble for a beat because she heard that voice. She knew that voice, but Kendrick didn't look at her for long. His eyes had already shifted to Brielle, the girl standing between his mother and that man, small, thin, blood on her mouth, arms hanging at her sides, not clenched, not raised, just hanging, but her feet not moving. She was shaking. He could see it clearly. A faint tremor in her shoulders, a faint tremor in her fingers, but not in her legs. Her legs stayed planted on the tile like roots, and her eyes held the man with the raised hand, not with the courage of the strong, but with the recklessness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Two things hit Kendrick at once. Rage for his mother, hot and red, wanting to burn the man in front of him down to ash. And something else, something he couldn't name, deeper and stranger, when he looked at this girl, a girl he didn't yet know, taking the blow for his mother with her thin body and her bleeding mouth while a room full of people couldn't move. He memorized her. In a fraction of a second, inside the rage, he memorized her. Then the rage won. Kendrick stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Each step even, like a count, like a clock hand, like knocking on a door the person inside didn't want to open. With every step, the floor felt heavier. With every step, the air felt thicker. The whole diner could feel that what had just walked in wasn't a customer, wasn't a good man coming to help. This was something ordinary people weren't meant to stand close to. Tucker's arm was still raised. He turned his head at the sound of footsteps, and for the first time he saw Kendrick Vaughn. He noticed the size first. Broad shoulders, heavy chest, long arms, a man as big as him but nothing like him. Tucker was big because of fat and a habit of taking up space. Kendrick was big because of muscle and something far more dangerous under that coat. Then Tucker saw the eyes, and the hand hanging in the air began to lower, not because he wanted it to, but because of instinct. Because Kendrick Vaughn's eyes right now weren't angry. They weren't afraid. They weren't anything. They were empty. Empty like the mouth of a gun. Empty like the last thing you see before everything goes black. Tucker swallowed. For the first time in 3 years, something in his gut tightened. Kendrick stopped 1 step away from him, close enough to smell beer on his breath, close enough that one reach would make contact. But he didn't reach. He only spoke, his voice low and level, like a blade sliding free of its sheath. "Put your hand down." Tucker lowered his hand, but he didn't lower his arrogance. He looked Kendrick up and down, searching for a reason not to be afraid, clinging to the 3 years of power he'd built on other people's fear. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still loud, but no longer as solid as it had been when he'd barked at Dorothy. "This ain't your business. Step out." Kendrick didn't answer him. He turned his back on Tucker, a move anyone from Kendrick's world would recognize as the deepest insult, because turning your back on someone meant they weren't dangerous enough to deserve your eyes. He dropped to his knees beside Dorothy. His hand touched his mother's shoulder gently, and his voice changed completely, soft, low, a slight tremor at the end. "Mom, he hit you?" Dorothy looked at her son, eyes still wet, cheek still swollen, and nodded, a small nod. Kendrick closed his eyes for 1 second, just one. Then he opened them. He turned to Brielle, the girl who was still standing there, not a step back, the blood on her lip beginning to dry into a dark streak. "He hit you too?" Brielle nodded. She didn't speak. Kendrick stood up, slowly, and the whole diner saw the change. When he knelt by his mother, he was a son. When he rose, he was Vaughn. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They burned. Not the kind of fire that flares and dies. The kind that lives deep under coals, quiet, hotter than any flame you can see, and never goes out until it decides to. Tucker saw that change. His stomach tightened again. He took a half step back without realizing he was stepping back. But Kendrick didn't hit him. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket, dialed a number, and said 4 words. "Montel, come in. Bring people." Then he hung up. 30 seconds. 30 seconds of silence while Tucker stood there not knowing what to do, because he'd never been in a situation where the silence didn't belong to him. He was the one who created silence, the one who controlled it. But now this silence belonged to the man standing in front of him, and Tucker was only a creature waiting inside it. The door opened. Montel stepped in first, shoulders like a steel cabinet, eyes cold, sweeping the room in 1 second, before taking a position to the side. Behind Montel came 2 more men, both tall, both wide, both wearing the blank, emotionless faces of men for whom feelings were a luxury. The 3 of them blocked the entrance, saying nothing, looking at no one but Tucker. The whole diner understood immediately. No explanations needed. No introductions. The way those 3 men stood, the way they looked, the way the air in the diner thickened by another layer, all of it said the same thing. These weren't ordinary men. And the man in the middle of the diner, the man who'd just said "Mom" with a shaking voice, was something Tucker Baines had never met in the 3 years he'd ruled this little town. Kendrick stepped close to Tucker. Close. Too close. Close enough that only the 2 of them could hear. And he spoke. His voice was low, even, unhurried, like he was reading a list. "I know your name is Tucker Baines. I know you live at 14 Birch Lane. 1-story house. Back door doesn't lock. I know you drive a blue 2009 Ford, plate ending in 741. I know you owe Freddie Loomis $8,000 in gambling debt. And I know there isn't a single person on this earth who'd come looking if you disappeared tonight." Tucker went pale. Not slowly. Instantly, like someone drained all the blood from his head in 1 second. His eyes blinked fast. His hand, the same hand that had slapped 2 women this morning, started to shake. He looked toward the door, where Montel and the 2 men stood blocking the way, then back at Kendrick. And he tasted it. For the first time in 3 years, the flavor he'd forced an entire town to swallow every day. Pure fear. Undiluted. No way to spit it out. "Now you've got 2 choices," Kendrick said, still in that voice, still in that rhythm, like he was talking about the weather. "1, you get on your knees and apologize to my mother and that girl, in front of everyone in this diner. 2, I walk outside, and the 3 men at the door are going to help you understand why choice 1 is a much, much better choice." Silence. Long. Heavy. Tucker looked at Montel. Montel didn't blink. Tucker looked at the 2 men beside him. They didn't blink either. Tucker looked back at Kendrick, and his knees buckled. Tucker Baines dropped to his knees on the floor of the Redstone Grill. For the first time in his life, both knees hit tile, shoulders collapsing, head bowed. The man who'd forced an entire town to lower their eyes for 3 years was now kneeling in the middle of the diner, in front of a dozen people he'd crushed and shaking. He turned toward Dorothy, eyes red, voice breaking. I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Dorothy didn't look at him. She looked at her son. Tucker turned to Brielle, and that was when it happened. Tucker knelt on the floor, his face level with Brielle's waist, and he tilted his head up to apologize. Sunlight from the window hit Brielle's face from the right, lighting up the features he'd never bothered to look at all this time, because she'd only been a waitress, invisible, not worth seeing. But now, from this angle, from below, with the light falling just right, he saw it. That jawline, the way her eyes held him, not with ordinary fear, but with the fear of someone who knew him, knew who he really was. The faint scar on her wrist, the one he knew exactly where it came from because he'd once watched her make it on the bathroom floor. Tucker's eyes went wide, his mouth moved. Jolene, a single word, a whisper. But in the silence of the diner, it landed like a scream. Brielle froze, her whole body locked up. Not the kind of stillness that's chosen, the kind that's paralysis, the kind where blood stops moving and lungs stop breathing and the world dissolves until there's only one thing left. That name. Her old name. The name she'd buried, burned, and run 400 miles so she'd never have to hear again. Her face went paler than the wall. Her eyes were open wide but seeing nothing. Her hands hung at her sides like they'd lost connection to her body. Kendrick stood there, watching it all. He saw Tucker say, Jolene. He saw Brielle turn into stone. He didn't understand. Not yet, but he took note. That name, that reaction. There was something between those two, older than this morning, deeper than a slap. And Kendrick Vaughn was the kind of man who didn't ignore what he didn't understand. Get up, Kendrick told Tucker, his voice going cold again. Get out of here. And if I hear your name in this town one more time, there won't be a third. Tucker staggered to his feet, legs shaking, eyes still stuck on Brielle, his mouth still forming Jolene like he was staring at a ghost. He lurched toward the door. Montel and the other 2 men shifted aside to let him pass, but their eyes tracked him like 3 bullets that hadn't been fired yet. Tucker disappeared into the sunlight outside, and the door shut behind him. The wind chime trembled one last time and went quiet. The whole diner stayed silent. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of shock, of a town that had just witnessed something they didn't dare believe. That Tucker Baines could kneel. That there was someone in this world who could make him kneel. The door closed behind Tucker, and the Redstone Grill began to breathe. Not normal breathing. The kind of breathing a person takes after they've almost drowned and finally break the surface, gasping, shaking, unable to believe they're still alive. Someone exhaled out loud. Someone pressed a hand to their chest. The 2 women who'd been sharing pancakes held hands under the table, fingers digging in tight, eyes red. The man with the newspaper lifted his head for the first time. The paper crumpled in his hands because he'd been gripping it the whole time without realizing. Ray Gentry behind the counter set his dish towel down, his hands still trembling, and he had to lean on the counter because his knees had gone soft. Montel stood guard at the door. The other 2 men had gone outside after Tucker to make sure he truly left. The diner was safe, at least for now. Kendrick didn't look at anyone. He turned back to Dorothy, dropped to his knees beside his mother, and all the power, all the threat, all the darkness he'd carried in with him vanished. There was only a 36-year-old man kneeling on tile beside his mother. He gently moved Dorothy's hand away from her cheek and checked the injury. Her cheek was swollen, red, the clear imprint of 5 fingers, but no blood on the outside. He touched the edge of the swelling with a fingertip, light as a butterfly wing, and Dorothy sucked in a sharp breath from the pain. Kendrick closed his eyes. His jaw clenched so hard the muscle stood out under his skin. He wanted to chase Tucker. He wanted to do more than what he'd just done. He wanted the hand that had hit his mother to never hit anyone again. But his mother was here, and his mother needed him here. He opened his eyes, drew a long breath, and asked softly, "Does it hurt bad? Are you dizzy? Do you feel nauseous?" Dorothy shook her head, her hands still trembling, but she tried to smile. "I'm fine. It's okay." Her voice shook. The smile convinced no one. Kendrick knew she was lying because Dorothy always lied when she hurt. She'd lied her whole life. When he was a kid, she'd said, "I already ate," even though he knew the fridge only held enough food for one person. She'd said, "I'm not tired," even though the shadows under her eyes came from 2 shifts in a row. She'd said, "I'm fine," when nothing was fine. Because that was how Dorothy loved, by carrying it alone so her son wouldn't have to worry. Kendrick helped his mother sit up, one hand supporting her back, one hand holding her hand. Dorothy sat on the floor and looked at her son, and only now did she truly look at him, closely. Her hand lifted and touched his face, tracing his jaw, tracing the bridge of his nose, like she was checking whether he was real or only a dream a mother made up because she missed her boy too much. "You set this up this morning?" she whispered. "The person buying me breakfast? That was you?" Kendrick nodded. "I wanted to surprise you." His voice shook. For the first time in this whole story, Kendrick Vaughn's voice shook. Not from fear, not from anger, from the fact that he'd planned it for weeks. Pictured himself walking into the diner and seeing his mother smile. Pictured the hug. Pictured a peaceful breakfast with just the 2 of them. Hot tea and toast. And instead he'd walked in and seen his mother on the floor. Dorothy heard the word surprise, and her tears broke. Not slowly. They broke, like a dam giving way. She pulled her son into her arms, both hands wrapping tight around his head, and he folded into her shoulder. The man, half a city feared, the man who'd made Tucker Baines kneel with a few calm sentences, was now pressing his forehead into the shoulder of a 67-year-old woman like a 5-year-old child, and his shoulders shook. No sound, but they shook. Dorothy held him, patting his back, whispering the same words over and over. "You're home. You're home. You're home." The words repeated like a lullaby, and every time she said them, Kendrick held on tighter. The whole diner watched. Nobody turned away. Nobody looked down. This time they were looking not from fear, but because what they were seeing was too beautiful, too painful, too real to miss. A son holding his mother on the tile floor of a messy diner. The pearl earring was still lying on the tile inches away. The dried blood on Brielle's lip still hadn't been wiped. Chairs were still knocked out of line. But in the middle of all that mess, 2 people were holding each other, and it was the most beautiful thing the Redstone Grill had ever contained. Kendrick helped his mother stand and guided her back to the window table. He picked up the pearl earring from the floor, wiped it gently on the edge of his coat, and placed it into his mother's palm. He sat across from her, caught Brielle's eye, and motioned for a fresh cup of tea. The 2 of them sat there in silence for a moment, hands clasped on the table. Dorothy looked at her son, eyes still wet but a smile on her face now. A real smile this time. She said, "You're thinner." Kendrick smiled. The first and only smile he'd shown in this whole story. Small, quick, but real. "You always say that." While mother and son sat at the window table holding hands, Brielle had slipped back behind the counter at some point without anyone noticing. She moved like a shadow, making no sound, drawing no attention. The instinct of someone who'd survived her whole life by making herself invisible. She used the corner of her apron to blot the dried blood at the edge of her mouth, quick and neat. No mirror, no need for anyone to see. Then she washed her hands, wiped down a tray, brewed a fresh cup of tea for Dorothy, and carried it to the window table. Her hands still trembled faintly, but she hid it by pressing the tray tight against her chest, tight enough that her fingers couldn't betray her. She set the tea in front of Dorothy, gave Kendrick a small nod without meeting his eyes, and turned away. Not a word. No waiting for thanks. No lingering so someone could say, "You were so brave," or, "Are you okay?" She simply went back to work, refilling coffee at table 4, clearing plates at table 6, as if 10 minutes earlier she hadn't taken a slap to the face for standing between an old woman and a bully. Kendrick watched her. He watched the narrow back and the stained apron, the light but hurried steps, the way she kept her head down when she passed customers like she was trying to make herself smaller. She didn't ask anyone for pity. She didn't take credit. She didn't look toward him even once. And that, exactly that, was what made Kendrick unable to look away. He turned to Dorothy. "Who is that girl, Mom?" Dorothy watched Brielle too, her eyes softening. "Brielle. She's worked here for years. Lives alone. No family. Nobody. Poor as can be. One day I saw her eating lunch with nothing but a leftover piece of bread from the kitchen." Dorothy paused and turned her teacup slowly. "But she's good. Truly good. Every Saturday I come in, She brews my tea before I even sit down. She remembers what I drink, what I eat, which table I like. Once when I had a cold, she put a warm cloth over my hands and didn't say a thing. Dorothy looked at her son, her voice dropping softer. She takes care of me like I'm her own mother. And I know she doesn't have a mother. Kendrick listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comment. But in his mind, pieces were sliding into place. A girl named Brielle, living alone. No family. Poor. Quiet. Afraid of contact. A scar on her wrist. And this morning, she'd stood in front of his mother while the whole diner froze, taken a slap and didn't fall. Said enough 3 times, and didn't step back. Then Tucker had knelt on the tile, looked up at her face, and said Jolene. A name, not Brielle. Jolene. And the way she'd reacted when she heard it, locking up, going pale, staring into nothing. That wasn't the reaction of someone being called the wrong name. That was the reaction of someone being found. Kendrick watched Brielle carrying a tray to the outer tables, sunlight catching in her hair, and he saw her hands tremble, but her feet didn't. There was a secret between this girl and Tucker Baines. A secret older than this morning, deeper than a slap. And Kendrick Vaughn wasn't the kind of man who let a secret lie quietly without turning it over. He didn't say anything to Dorothy. He only gave a small nod, lifted his teacup to his mouth, and watched Brielle one last time before turning back to his mother. He would find out. Not now, but he would. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of the Redstone Grill. Officer Pamela Cortez stepped out, 38 years old, black hair pulled into a tight ponytail, uniform sharply pressed, eyes as sharp as a blade. She was the only female officer in the Crestwood Falls Police Department. And she was also the only one in the department Tucker Baines couldn't buy, couldn't bully, couldn't force to bow her head. Cortez had hated Tucker since before he got fired. She'd written 3 internal reports about his behavior, and all 3 had been tossed into a drawer by supervisors. When he beat the 19-year-old kid and got protected, Cortez was the only one who voted against him in the disciplinary meeting. She lost, but she didn't forget. She walked into the diner and scanned the scene in a few seconds. Chairs knocked out of place. A faint smear of blood on the floor even though someone had tried to wipe it, faces pale all around. Dorothy at the window table with a swollen red cheek, next to a large man Cortez recognized immediately. Not because she knew Kendrick personally, but because in a small town everybody knew Dorothy had a son who did big business in the city. Cortez didn't ask who Kendrick was, didn't ask who Montel at the door was. She'd been a cop long enough to know when to ask, and when the answer would be more complicated than she felt like handling. She focused on what mattered. "Who called 911?" she asked. Ray Gentry lifted a trembling hand from behind the counter. Cortez nodded, pulled out her notebook, and started taking statements. And something strange happened. For the first time in 3 years, the people of Crestwood Falls spoke. Not one person. Many. The 2 women who'd been sharing pancakes talked over each other, voices still shaking but mouths refusing to stop. The man with the newspaper stood up and spoke clearly, calmly, like he'd been waiting 3 years to say this sentence. He slapped the old lady. No reason. I saw it plain. An older couple nodded to confirm. Ray Gentry told the whole story from start to finish, his hand still gripping the dish towel, but his voice wasn't shaking anymore. Cortez wrote everything down, didn't interrupt anyone, didn't rush. When she had enough, she asked Ray to pull up the security camera. The clip was short, shot from the ceiling, no sound, but clear enough. Dorothy walked past. Her coat sleeve brushed Tucker's shoulder. Tucker stood up and slapped her to the floor. Clear. No argument. No second angle needed. Cortez watched it twice, then closed her notebook. "I'm putting out a warrant for Tucker Baines. Assault on an elderly person and assault on a woman." She said it calmly, but her eyes were bright. 3 years of waiting. 3 reports shoved into a drawer. Dozens of times watching Tucker swagger down the street and being unable to do a thing because nobody would testify. Now she had video, she had witnesses, she had victims willing to speak. This time, Tucker wouldn't walk away. Before leaving, Cortez pulled Brielle aside into a corner, gentle but firm. "You're the one who stepped in front of that elderly woman?" Brielle nodded, eyes down. "He hit you too?" Brielle nodded again. Cortez looked at her lip, the swelling already turning bruised, the dried blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. Then Cortez's eyes moved lower, and she saw Brielle's wrist, a faint old scar, Not from this morning, not from Tucker, but from something farther back, deeper, more private. Cortez was the kind of officer who noticed what other people missed. She'd seen scars like that before, on the wrists of women she'd pulled out of dark houses at midnight. She knew what that scar was trying to say. She made a note in her notebook, quick and discreet, then asked softly, "Do you want to go to the hospital and get checked out?" Brielle shook her head. "I'm fine." The words slid out of her mouth smooth and natural, no hesitation, like she'd said them 1,000 times before. And maybe she had. Cortez studied her for a long moment, not believing her, but not pushing. She'd been in the job long enough to know that forcing a woman with scars on her wrist to tell her story before she was ready only made her lock the door tighter. "If you need anything," Cortez said, handing Brielle a business card, "call me, anytime." Brielle took the card, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went back to work. Cortez watched her for one more second, then walked out, climbed into her cruiser, and drove back to the station. She had an arrest warrant to write, and a feeling she couldn't yet name, that the story of that waitress was a lot more complicated than a slap in a diner on a Sunday morning. That night, at 9:43, Cortez and a colleague pulled up in front of 14 Birch Lane, a one-story house, paint peeling, the front door cracked open, dull yellow light spilling out along with the sound of a television turned up too loud. Cortez knocked. Nobody opened. She knocked again, harder. Heavy footsteps inside. Then Tucker Baines opened the door, a beer can in his hand, eyes red, his face still marked with the dried tracks of tears from when he'd knelt in the diner. He saw Cortez and he understood immediately. He didn't run, not because he was brave, but because he knew there was nowhere to run, at least not tonight. Not with Cortez standing in front of him and a partner behind her. "Tucker Baines, you're under arrest for assaulting an elderly person and assaulting a woman," Cortez said, voice even and professional. But her eyes couldn't hide the satisfaction. 3 years. She'd waited 3 years for this moment. When the cuffs clicked around Tucker's wrists, he didn't resist. But as Cortez walked him toward the cruiser, he started talking. No, not talking. Screaming. "Wait, wait. I've got information. That waitress at the diner, I know who she is." Cortez didn't slow down. He screamed louder, his voice cracking, spit flying. "Her real name is Jolene Pruitt. She's my wife. She ran 3 years ago. I'm Wade Pruitt. Check it. Check the records." Cortez stopped, not because Tucker convinced her, but because 2 words jumped out of his yelling and stabbed straight into the hunch she'd had since noon. The scar on Brielle's wrist. She turned and looked at him. "Wade Pruitt." "Yeah. My real name is Wade Pruitt. I changed it when I came here. And Jolene changed hers too. She's my wife. She ran. Shut up," Cortez cut in. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." She shoved him into the back seat and slammed the door. Tucker kept shouting inside, his face pressed to the window, his mouth still forming Jolene like a prayer from a madman. Cortez drove back to the station, handed Tucker off to her colleague for booking, then sat at her desk and opened her computer. She typed, "Wade Pruitt. Enter." A file popped up from the federal database. Wade Pruitt, 45 years old, state of Georgia. Charged with aggravated domestic violence, strangulation of spouse, death threats. A warrant issued 5 years ago. Suspect fled, failed to appear, still wanted. The attached photo showed a face a few years younger, fewer lines, less weight, but the same cloudy eyes, the same thick jaw, the same look of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Tucker Baines, Wade Pruitt, the same man. Cortez scrolled down. Victim, Jolene Pruitt, 24 at the time of the report, missing for 3 years, having escaped the suspect long after his initial flight, believed to have left voluntarily to escape violence. There was no photo of Jolene in the file, but Cortez didn't need one. She remembered Brielle's eyes from earlier that day, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much for 27, the scar on her wrist, the way "I'm fine" came out smooth, like it had been said 1,000 times, and the way she'd reacted when Tucker knelt on the floor and said Jolene, locking up, going pale, body freezing like a deer in headlights. Cortez called a contact in Georgia and requested fingerprint confirmation. 20 minutes later, the result came back, a complete match. Tucker Baines was Wade Pruitt. Same fingerprints, same man. The bully who'd terrorized Crestwood Falls for 3 years was in fact a wanted domestic abuser who'd changed his name, changed states, and lived in plain sight while nobody knew. And the waitress at the Redstone Grill, the one who'd taken a slap and didn't fall, the one who'd said enough 3 times, the one Dorothy called a good girl, was Jolene Pruitt, the wife who'd run from him 3 years earlier, with $47 and a scar on her wrist. Cortez sat still for a moment. She stared at the screen, at Wade Pruitt's file, at the words strangulation and death threats, and she thought about Brielle standing in front of Tucker that morning, small and thin, blood on her mouth, eyes fixed on the same man who'd once wrapped his hands around her throat on a kitchen floor, and saying, "Enough." That girl knew who Tucker was. Maybe she didn't know he'd changed his name, but her body knew. Her instincts knew. The smell of beer, the shouted voice, the way he took up space, the way he stood over people. Brielle's body recognized Wade Pruitt before her mind could catch up, and she still stood there. Cortez picked up the phone and called Brielle's number from the employee information Ray Gentry had provided earlier. It rang 4 times. "Hello." Brielle's voice was small, tired, guarded. "Brielle, this is Officer Cortez. We arrested Tucker Baines tonight." A short silence on the other end. Then Brielle said, "Okay, just one word." Cortez drew in a breath. During the arrest, Tucker Baines stated his real name is Wade Pruitt, and he said, "You're Jolene Pruitt." No sound came from the other end. Not a silence of waiting. The silence of someone whose lungs have just been emptied. Then Cortez heard the phone drop. Not set down, dropped, plastic hitting wood, then breathing, fast, broken, shallow. The sound of someone hyperventilating, losing control, falling into a panic the body remembered from 3 years ago. Cortez called out, "Brielle, Brielle, can you hear me?" No answer. Only that ragged breathing, faster and faster, and something thudding against a wall, maybe her back as she slid down, sitting hard on the floor. Then the sound of vomiting. Cortez closed her eyes, her hand tightening around the phone. She didn't need confirmation anymore. That reaction was the answer. Brielle Ashford was Jolene Pruitt, and the man who'd strangled her, who'd sworn he would find her, who'd said, "Next time I won't stop," had been living 3 streets away from her for 3 years. He'd sat drinking free beer in the diner where she worked every day. He'd passed her 100 times without looking close enough. And that morning, she'd stood in front of him, met his eyes, and said, "Enough," without knowing he was the nightmare she'd been running from for 3 years. Or maybe she did know. Maybe her body had always known, and she still stood there. At the same time, in Dorothy's house on Oak Street, Kendrick sat in the small kitchen under yellow light, a cold cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't taken a single sip from. Dorothy was asleep. He'd iced her cheek, made ginger tea for her to drink, sat beside her bed until her eyes finally closed, and only then came out to the kitchen. His phone vibrated. "Montel, you need to hear this." Kendrick listened. Montel wasn't a talker, but tonight he spoke in one clear run, like he was reading a report he knew would change everything. Montel's source at the police department, not Cortez. Someone else. Someone the Vaughn Syndicate had had ties to for a long time. Confirmed it. Tucker Baines was really Wade Pruitt, wanted in the state of Georgia for severe domestic violence, strangulation of his wife, death threats. He'd changed his name, changed states, skipped court for 3 years. The ex-wife was Jolene Pruitt. She has been missing for 3 years, while Wade Pruitt has been a fugitive for 5. Montel paused, then added one more sentence. That waitress at the diner, Brielle Ashford. Her real name is Jolene Pruitt. Kendrick didn't speak. Montel waited on the other end of the line, used to his boss's silence, knowing Kendrick wasn't quiet because he hadn't heard, but because he was putting everything back together in his head. And Kendrick was, piece by piece. Brielle Ashford was Jolene Pruitt, the skinny waitress, the scar on her wrist, living alone, no family, sleeping with a knife under her pillow, running for 3 years, changing her name, changing her life, doing everything she could to disappear from one man. And that man was Tucker Baines, the man who sat at the middle table of the diner where she worked every day, the man who'd slapped Kendrick's mother that morning, the man Brielle had faced, looked straight in the eye, and said, "Enough." Kendrick closed his eyes. He replayed that morning, the moment he'd walked into the diner and seen Brielle standing between Tucker and his mother. Small, thin, blood on her lip, shaking but not stepping back. At the time, he'd thought she was brave. Now he understood she wasn't only brave, she'd been staring straight at the worst nightmare of her life. She knew what kind of man he was, because she'd lived with him. She knew what that hand could do, because that hand had closed around her throat. She knew that if he looked closely, he would recognize her, and everything she'd built for 3 years, the new name, the new life, the fragile safety, would shatter, and she still stepped forward, still stood there, for his mother, for Dorothy, for the woman who'd placed an old scarf on her shoulders and said, "It's cold and you don't have a warm coat." She knew, Kendrick said slowly, his voice low. She knew he might recognize her. She knew she was putting herself in danger, and she still stood there. "For my mother." Montel was quiet on the other end, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew Kendrick was talking to himself more than he was talking to him. "Call the lawyer," Kendrick said, and his voice changed, becoming Vaughn again, cold, precise, stripped of anything extra. "Tell him to find every probation violation, every warrant, every charge on Wade Pruitt. Call Georgia State Police. Call the federal prosecutor if we have to. Interstate, false identity, skipping court. I want him to never see daylight outside bars again. Not 6 months, not a year, years. Enough years that when he walks out, he'll be an old man nobody's afraid of." "Got it," Montel said. "Anything else?" Kendrick was silent for a moment. He stared out the kitchen window into Oak Street's dark, the little town sleeping, and somewhere only a few streets away, a 27-year-old woman was sitting on the floor of a shabby studio alone in the dark, and the world she'd thought was safe had just collapsed completely. "Find Brielle Ashford's address," Kendrick said. Then he hung up. The next morning at 9, Kendrick stood in front of the old building on Elm Street, alone. Montel waited in the car parked at the end of the block, close enough to reach him in 30 seconds if needed. Far enough not to put pressure on her. Kendrick had asked for that. Just me, nobody else. Montel had wanted to argue, but one look at Kendrick's eyes told him this wasn't the moment to argue. The building was 3 stories, paint peeling, an exterior iron staircase rusted through, the railing loose. Kendrick climbed 1 step at a time, each step creaking under his weight. He looked around. The alley below was dark even in daylight, a trash bin overflowing in the corner. A bicycle with a broken handlebar leaned against the wall. This was where she lived. This was where the woman who'd faced Tucker Baines and said enough went every night, locked her door, and tried to sleep. Kendrick Vaughn lived in a penthouse, ran an empire, rode in a black car with a driver, and the girl who'd saved his mother lived in a building whose stairs could collapse at any moment. He stopped at the 3rd-floor door. Weathered wood, flaking paint, an old lock, the kind a single kick could blow open. He knocked, softly, 2 short knocks, loud enough to hear, not urgent. Silence inside, then footsteps, very light, very slow. The sound of someone approaching the door without deciding whether to open it. The footsteps stopped right behind the door. Brielle was standing there. He knew it, listening, trying to sort out whether this knock was safe or dangerous. An old habit, a survival habit. "Brielle," Kendrick said, his voice carrying through the thin door. "I'm Dorothy's son." Silence held for 3 seconds. Then the lock turned. The door opened a crack, just wide enough for Brielle to look through with one eye. He saw her eye first, swollen, dark circles, red from crying. Then she opened the door wider, and he saw her. Hair messy, not brushed. An old nightshirt too big, hanging on bony shoulders. Bare feet on cold wood. And the moment she saw a man's shape in her doorway, her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Shoulders tensed, half a step back, one hand gripping the edge of the door, jaw clenched, eyes wide, not with curiosity, but with readiness, ready to run, ready to take a hit, ready for whatever came, because her body had been trained for it for years. Kendrick saw all of it. He'd seen many kinds of fear in his life. The fear of an enemy cornered, the fear of an ally betrayed, the fear of a man who owed money when time ran out. But the fear on Brielle's face was different. This was fear soaked into bone, into muscle, into every nerve. Fear that didn't need a specific reason anymore because it had become the default state. He took a step back. On purpose. Clear. Creating space between him and her, enough for her to see he wasn't coming closer, wasn't blocking her, wasn't standing where she couldn't run if she needed to. He hadn't thought about this before he came, but seeing her shrink in that doorway, his instincts understood. This was a woman for whom every man approaching was a threat until proven otherwise. "I'm not coming in," he said. "I'm standing right here." Brielle looked at him, at the step he'd taken back, at the distance he'd made, and she didn't speak, but her hand loosened on the doorframe. A little, enough for Kendrick to know she was listening. "I know who Tucker Baines really is," he said, his voice low and steady, eyes on hers. "I know his real name is Wade Pruitt, and I know you're Jolene Pruitt." Brielle didn't move, but her eyes changed. That name, that old name, every time it was spoken, something inside her cracked a little more. Her knuckles turned white again on the edge of the door. "I know you ran from him 3 years ago," Kendrick continued, his tone unchanged, not faster, not slower. "I know what he did to you. And I know yesterday morning you stood in front of him, the man who almost killed you, and you didn't run. You stood there. You protected my mother." Brielle swallowed. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "You knew he could recognize you at any moment," Kendrick said, and now his voice shifted, softer, no longer Vaughn. "You knew if he recognized you, you'd lose everything. Your hiding place, your new name, your safety, everything you built for 3 years, and you still stepped out. For my mother, for an old woman you didn't owe a thing." Tears slid down Brielle's face. No sobs, no sound, just falling, quiet, like water spilling over the rim of a cup, unstoppable. She didn't wipe them. She didn't look away. She just stood there in the doorway of her shabby studio, bare feet on cold boards, and cried without hiding. "You don't have to run anymore," Kendrick said. Brielle sucked in a sharp breath. Those 4 words hit her harder than any slap she'd ever taken, because nobody had ever said them to her. Not once. 3 years of running, 3 years of changing names, 3 years of checking locks every night, 3 years of flinching at heavy footsteps, and not one person had ever given her those 4 words. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking, rough, like her throat had forgotten how to make sound. "He always finds me. Every time. This time is different. Every time someone says it's different." Kendrick went quiet for a second. Then he said, slow and clear, each word separate, "I'm not just someone. You know that." Brielle looked at him. For the first time since she'd opened the door, she looked straight into his eyes. Not a glance. Not sideways. Straight. And she saw something she had never seen in any man who'd stood in her doorway. Not pity. She'd seen pity before. In social workers' eyes. In emergency room nurses' eyes. In a former landlord's eyes. Not ownership. She'd seen that too. In Wade's eyes. In the way he'd said "you're mine" in a sweet voice, before using that same mouth to spit curses at her. What she saw in Kendrick's eyes was respect. Respect for someone he knew, had done what he wasn't sure he could do himself. "Yesterday morning you protected my mother," Kendrick said. "Now let me protect you." He didn't step closer. He didn't lift a hand. He didn't touch her. He didn't cross her threshold. He stood there a step away, arms at his sides, and waited. Brielle stood in the doorway, tears still falling, bare feet still planted, body still shaking. She didn't speak, but she nodded, slightly, once. Kendrick nodded back. Then he took another step back, turned, and walked down the rusted stairs. He didn't look back. He didn't say more. His footsteps rang on iron, each beat echoing in the quiet alley. Brielle stood in the doorway watching until his shadow disappeared at the bottom of the stairs. Then she shut the door, leaned her back against the weathered wood, slid down to the floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and cried. But this time was different. This time she wasn't crying from fear, or pain, or loneliness. She was crying because for the first time in 3 years, someone had stood at her door, knew who she really was, knew what she had done, knew what she had escaped, and didn't leave, didn't step in and take over, didn't demand anything. He only said she didn't have to run anymore, then stepped back, turned away, and let her decide. 2 weeks after that Sunday morning, the preliminary hearing took place at the Crestwood County Courthouse. Cortez hadn't slept much in those 2 weeks. She'd been on the phone with Georgia State Police, sending fingerprints, matching records, confirming identity, coordinating interstate document transfers. Every day, the charges stacked higher on Tucker Baines, or rather, Wade Pruitt, another layer added on top. Aggravated domestic violence in Georgia, strangulation of a spouse, death threats, skipping court, using a false identity, assaulting an elderly person in Crestwood Falls, assaulting a woman, interstate charges. Each count was a brick, and Cortez built that wall carefully, one brick at a time, not rushing, not leaving a single crack for Tucker to slip through. The attorney Kendrick hired arrived in Crestwood Falls on the third day after the incident. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, a gray suit, a leather briefcase, eyes cold as steel but a gentle voice when he spoke to Dorothy and Brielle. He represented both of them, free of charge, without explaining who was paying. Dorothy didn't ask. Brielle didn't ask. But both of them knew the answer lived in the man who'd stood at Brielle's door and said, "Let me protect you." On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was small, the ceiling low, fluorescent light harsh and white. Hard wooden benches lined up in 4 rows, nearly full. People from Crestwood Falls came, not out of curiosity, but because for the first time they wanted to watch justice with their own eyes. Ray Gentry sat in the second row, still clutching his familiar dish towel even though he didn't need it, a habit he couldn't break. The 2 women who'd shared pancakes sat side by side, shoulders touching. Cortez stood at the prosecution's table, uniform crisp, notebook in hand. Tucker was brought in through the side door, and the entire courtroom fell silent when they saw him. Not silent out of fear, silent out of disbelief. The man who'd forced a whole town to lower their eyes for 3 years now wore an orange jail uniform, wrists cuffed in front of his stomach, shoulders slumped, back rounded, eyes fixed on the floor. He looked smaller. Not smaller in body, he was still big, still broad-shouldered, but the thing that made him big, the power, the fear he'd pressed onto everyone else, had been pulled out of him, and without it, he was only a tired, middle-aged man in an oversized jail uniform. Tucker sat in the defendant's chair and didn't look at anyone. The prosecutor went first and read the charges. The list was long. Each charge landed in the courtroom like a hammer driving a nail. Aggravated domestic violence, strangulation, threatening to kill, skipping court, interstate false identity, assault of a person over 65, assault of a woman. Tucker didn't react. He sat with his head down, like someone who already knew the outcome and no longer had the strength to fear it. Dorothy took the witness stand first. She spoke briefly and clearly, her voice shaking but not stopping. The slap, the tile floor, the swollen cheek, the demand that she kneel and apologize. She didn't look at Tucker as she spoke. She looked at the lawyer, the judge, straight ahead, as if she were telling the whole world she wouldn't bow her head, not to Tucker, not to anyone. Then it was Brielle's turn. She stepped onto the witness stand, and the whole courtroom watched her. She wore a white blouse borrowed from Dorothy, a little loose at the shoulders. Her hair was neatly brushed. The bruise on her lip had nearly healed but still showed. Her hands gripped the edge of the stand so hard her knuckles went white. She inhaled, exhaled. Then she spoke. "My name is Jolene Pruitt." The courtroom rippled with whispers, then went quiet again when the judge looked down. Brielle kept going, her voice shaking but refusing to stop, like water held back too long and now nothing could dam it. "I changed my name to Brielle Ashford 3 years ago, to run from the man sitting there. The man you call Tucker Baines. His real name is Wade Pruitt. He is my ex-husband," she told them. All of it. For the first time, in front of a courtroom full of strangers, she spoke the things she hadn't said to anyone in 3 years. The punches, the door locked from the outside, the phone taken, the night on the kitchen floor when his hands closed around her throat and her eyes rolled back and her legs stopped kicking, and the last thing he said before she ran, "Next time I won't stop." Her voice shook from beginning to end, but she didn't stop. Not once. She spoke like someone who'd carried a stone on her back for 3 years and today, finally, got to set it down. Tucker bowed his head lower, lower still. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. His cuffed hands clenched in his lap, and for the first time in that courtroom, he looked like exactly what he was. A small, cowardly man who'd only ever been strong when he was standing over someone weaker. The judge reviewed the file, listened to the prosecution, listened to the defense attorney appointed to Tucker, and made a decision without taking long. Bail denied. Held without release pending trial, with the Georgia charges folded into the case. Tucker Baines, Wade Pruitt, faced years in prison. Years. Enough years that when he walked out, the world outside would be different, and he would be the old man Kendrick had promised. Outside the courthouse, Crestwood Falls' sunlight looked brighter than usual, or maybe that was only how it felt to people stepping out of a dim room. Cortez stood beside her car, watched Brielle come down the courthouse steps, and said softly, "You were brave." Brielle shook her head, eyes still red but dry, no tears left to cry. "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of running." 2 weeks after the hearing, on a Friday afternoon, Dorothy called Brielle, not through the diner phone, but on a private number Brielle had given her after court, the first time she'd offered her own number to anyone willingly in 3 years. "Can you come to my house for dinner tonight?" Dorothy asked, in a normal voice, like she invited her every day. Like this wasn't the first time in Brielle's life a mother had invited her over for a meal. Brielle hesitated. She'd never gone to anyone's house. Not ever. Wade's apartment didn't count because it was a prison, not a home. The foster families didn't count because she'd never been treated like she belonged. She didn't know what to bring, what to wear, what to say when you went to someone's house for dinner, because she had no blueprint in her head for this situation. But she managed it. "Yes, ma'am." At 6 in the evening, she stood in front of the little house at the end of Oak Street. 1 story, gray roof, a low white fence gone yellow with age, a front yard with a few potted flowers Dorothy cared for, not pretty, but alive, still blooming even though the soil wasn't good. Brielle stood at the gate for almost a minute before she dared to press the bell. The door opened and the smell of food rushed out. Roasted chicken, potatoes, melting butter, gas stove, the smell of a kitchen, the smell of a home. Brielle breathed in and something in her chest stung because she couldn't remember the last time she'd stepped into a place that smelled like this. Dorothy stood in the doorway in a floral apron, a wooden spoon in her hand, smiling. "Come on in, sweetheart. Dinner's almost ready." Inside, the house was small, clean, warm. An old sofa with a hand-knit throw. A little bookshelf with a few Bibles and cookbooks, thin curtains that let the late afternoon light through. And on the wall, photos. Brielle stopped in front of a framed picture near the kitchen doorway. A white boy, thin, around 9 or 10, standing in front of a smaller house than this one, grinning with all his teeth, eyes bright, holding an old basketball. Brielle stared at the photo and recognized those eyes. The same eyes she'd seen in the doorway of her shabby studio, eyes that looked at her with respect instead of pity. But in this photo, those eyes hadn't learned darkness yet. They only knew a basketball and a smile. Dorothy followed her gaze. He was so skinny back then. Couldn't put weight on no matter what he ate. "I worried myself sick." She gave a soft laugh and went back into the kitchen. They ate at the small kitchen table, just enough room for 2 chairs. Dorothy set out roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, salad, and hot cornbread. Nothing fancy, but plenty. More than Brielle had cooked for herself in the last 3 years, because she usually lived on bread with peanut butter or instant noodles. Not because she couldn't cook, but because cooking for one didn't feel like there was any reason to try. They ate in silence most of the time. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence only 2 people who feel safe with each other can share. The kind that doesn't need to be filled because the presence itself is enough. Dorothy didn't ask about court. She didn't ask about Wade. She didn't ask about the past. She only put more chicken on Brielle's plate when it emptied, poured more water when her glass ran low, and said, "Eat, baby," in a voice Brielle wanted to hear for the rest of her life. At the end of the meal, Dorothy set her plate down, wiped her hands on her apron, and reached across the table for Brielle's hand. Dorothy's hand was small, wrinkled, warm, closing around Brielle's hand resting there, and Brielle let it stay, didn't pull back, didn't flinch, because she trusted this hand. "Listen to me," Dorothy said, looking straight into Brielle's eyes. "From now on you come here anytime you want. No reason needed, no calling first. This door is always open for you." Brielle looked at Dorothy's hand holding hers, looked at the warm little kitchen, looked at the photo of the boy grinning with all his teeth on the wall, and she cried. But this time the tears weren't like the ones before. Not tears of fear, or pain, or loneliness, or hyperventilating on a studio floor at midnight. These were healing tears, the kind that only come when you finally find a place where you don't have to explain who you are, don't have to hide your scars, don't have to pretend you're fine. Dorothy didn't say more. She only held on tighter, her thumb gently rubbing the back of Brielle's hand, and let her cry. 2 women sat in a small kitchen at the end of Oak Street. One 67-year-old white woman, one 27-year-old white woman, hands clasped across a half-cleared table, and for the first time, Neither of them was alone. Kendrick stayed in Crestwood Falls for 5 more days after the hearing. The reason he gave Montel was that he was staying with his mother. The reason he gave himself, he didn't say out loud. Every morning, he went to the Redstone Grill. He sat at a table near the door, a table nobody used to choose because it was close to the exit and cold every time someone came in. But Kendrick liked it because from there he could see the whole diner without ever turning his head. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, nothing added. Brielle brought it. On the first day, she set the cup down without looking at him, quick and clean and professional, then turned away. On the second day, she set the cup down and paused for half a second, long enough for Kendrick to say, "Thank you," and for her to nod once before she turned away. On the third day, she set the cup down and asked, "Still no sugar today?" 4 words. 4 ordinary words any waitress might say to any regular customer. But it was the first time Brielle had chosen to say something to him that wasn't, "Yes, ma'am," or a silent nod. And Kendrick understood that for her, those 4 words were worth more than any speech. "Still no sugar," he said. She nodded and walked away, and Kendrick watched her, then looked down at the cup, then out the window, and wondered when he'd started noticing how she tied her hair differently each morning. One day with a black elastic, one day with a small clip, one day left loose to brush her shoulders because she'd forgotten to bring a tie. They spoke in short lines, very short, slow, careful, like 2 people walking across thin ice. Every step light, every word weighed. Kendrick asked whether the diner was busy. Brielle said it was quieter than the day before. Kendrick asked if his mother had come in. Brielle said Dorothy arrived at 8, finished her breakfast and went home. And today she'd been happy. Nothing more, nothing deeper. But every day the conversation gained one more sentence. Every day Brielle stood at his table a few seconds longer before walking away. And every day the distance between them shortened, not the physical distance, but the distance between 2 people who were used to hiding, used to not trusting, and were slowly, very slowly, allowing themselves to be seen. On the 4th day, Brielle carried his coffee out and stumbled on the small step between the counter and the dining area. She pitched forward, the cup tilting, about to spill. Kendrick stood up, fast and instinctive, without thinking, and his hand caught her by the elbow. Firm, gentle, enough to steady her, not enough to feel like a grip. The coffee didn't spill. Brielle stayed upright, and his hand was there on her elbow for 2 seconds. 2 seconds both of them felt more clearly than any 2 seconds in their lives. Then he let go. Brielle glanced at the spot where his hand had been, quick, then looked up at his face, then looked away. She set the coffee down in front of him, murmured, "Sorry," so softly it almost didn't count as a sound, and walked away. Kendrick sat back down, stared at the cup, and didn't drink for 5 minutes. The 5th day was the last. Kendrick knew he had to leave. The Vaughn syndicate didn't run itself. Montel had called 3 times the day before. Work was waiting. His real world was waiting. That morning the diner was quiet. Only the man with the newspaper in the corner and a young couple with a small child at the middle table, the table Tucker used to claim, and now there was a child's laughter there. Kendrick sat in his usual spot. Black coffee. Brielle brought it. She set the cup down, and this time she didn't walk away right away. She stood there with her tray pressed to her chest, looking at him like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Kendrick looked at her. Then he took a small envelope from his coat pocket, white, unmarked, unsealed, and placed it on the table beside the coffee. "My phone number," he said. "Anytime you need it. Anything. Anytime." Brielle looked at the envelope, then at him. Her eyes weren't wet this time, but there was something in them Kendrick couldn't read. Or maybe he could read it, and didn't dare believe it. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." Kendrick nodded. He stood. He left money on the table, far more than the price of a cup of coffee, but both of them knew it wasn't a tip. He looked at her one more second, then turned and walked out. He didn't look back. The wind chime rattled when the door opened and closed, and his shadow crossed the glass, heading toward the black car parked at the end of the street where Montel was waiting. Brielle stood at his table, staring at the empty chair, staring at the warm mark on the tabletop where the cup had just been set. Then she picked up the envelope. Light, thin. Inside was only a folded piece of paper with a string of numbers in neat, steady handwriting, the kind of handwriting that matched the man who'd written it. She tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and carried it all day, past every table she served, past every tray she lifted, through every hour until the diner closed, and she went back to her studio on Elm Street. That night, Brielle opened her bedside drawer. Inside was the small knife she'd kept hidden there for 3 years. The thing she'd gripped every night when footsteps in the hallway made her jolt. The only thing that gave her any sense of safety in the dark. She looked at the knife. Then she looked at the envelope. She took the knife out and put it in the kitchen drawer, and she placed the envelope where the knife had been. She still didn't call. Maybe she wouldn't tomorrow either. Maybe not next week. But every night when she lay down and glanced at the drawer, she knew it was there. And that alone, the knowledge that there was a number, a promise, a man who'd stepped back from her doorway so she wouldn't have to be afraid, changed how Brielle slept each night. For the first time in 3 years, she closed her eyes without clenching her fist. Crestwood Falls changed. Not in a single day. Not in one dramatic moment. But slowly and softly. The way a wound heals when nobody's watching. The voices inside the Redstone Grill grew louder. Not louder with shouting, with barking orders, with fear. Louder because people finally dared to speak in their real voices. Ray Gentry started greeting customers by name. "Morning, Mr. Morrison. How you feeling today? Hi, Mrs. Jenkins. Pancakes like usual?" Instead of lowering his eyes and serving in silence the way he had for 3 years. Mr. Morrison, the 72-year-old black man who'd been shoved down by Tucker in front of the grocery store, now walked in the middle of the sidewalk, his knees still aching but his back a little straighter, because there was no longer a man behind him that he had to fear. The middle table, the table Tucker Baines used to claim every day, legs stretched out to block the aisle, arms spread wide like a king, was now the favorite table of a young family. The husband sat on the left, the wife on the right, their small child in the high chair between them, crumbs of bread scattered all over the tabletop. A child's laughter filled the space where there used to be only shouting, and nobody in the diner minded that laughter. Brielle still waited tables at the Redstone Grill. She still woke up at 4:30 every morning. She still arrived first, tied on her apron, pulled her hair back, wiped down the tables. She was still poor. But she wasn't the same girl she'd been 4 weeks earlier. She no longer scanned her surroundings before stepping out the door each morning. She no longer took the long way around to avoid the middle table. She no longer flinched when the wind chime on the door rang because a customer walked in. She began greeting customers by name, something she'd never dared before, because saying someone's name meant letting them come close, and close used to mean danger. Now, close didn't mean danger anymore. Every Saturday morning, Dorothy still came to the Redstone Grill. But she didn't sit alone at the window table anymore. Now, on Brielle's break, Brielle sat across from her. 2 cups of tea, a plate of toast. The old wool scarf draped over the back of the chair, the scarf Dorothy had placed on Brielle's shoulders on a cold morning months ago, the scarf Brielle still kept, still carried, still held on the nights she couldn't sleep. 2 women by the window with morning sun pouring in, talking quietly about ordinary things. The weather was nice today. The flowers in Dorothy's yard had finally bloomed. Ray Gentry's whistling sounded better than it used to. Nobody mentioned that Sunday morning. They didn't need to. It lived there anyway, in the way they looked at each other, in the way Dorothy reached across the table and held Brielle's hand, in the way Brielle called her Mom when nobody could hear, and then, little by little, even when someone could. Sometimes, not often, but enough for Brielle to notice the pattern. On certain Sunday mornings, the Redstone Grill door would open, the wind chime would sing softly, and a tall figure would step in. A dark coat, broad shoulders, even footsteps. He would sit at the table near the door. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Brielle would bring it out. Her hands didn't shake anymore, and he, every time, would take the cup, look at her, and say, "Thank you," in a voice she knew he didn't use with anyone else. 1 word, but enough. The envelope in the bedside drawer was still there. She still hadn't called. But some nights, when she lay down and the town outside was quiet, she would reach a hand toward the drawer, feel it there, and smile in the dark. Tucker Baines chose the wrong person. He slapped the mother of a boss, in front of the ex-wife he thought he'd lost. But his biggest mistake wasn't choosing the wrong victim. It was not understanding that in Crestwood Falls, fear can't live forever, because in the end, there will always be someone who sets a tray down, steps out from behind the counter, and says 2 words. Enough. The story of Kendrick, of Brielle, and of Dorothy reminds us that courage doesn't belong to the strongest person in the room. It belongs to the person who stands when everyone else stays seated. That family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's an old scarf, a cup of tea already made, and a simple sentence. This door is always open for you. That anyone, no matter how many times life has knocked them down, can still get back up, can still protect someone else, can still choose love instead of fear. If this story touched your heart, please hit like so it can reach more people. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, because sometimes one story can change the way someone looks at life. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day. We want to hear you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up when everyone else stayed silent? Or in real life, have you ever met a Dorothy, a stranger who treated you with a kindness your own family never gave you? Leave a comment, share your story, because we read every line and we listen to every word from the deepest places in your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and happiness every day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.